Well, welcome to another installment of Head First JavaScript Programming Teasers. In this installment, we're going to take a look at how to use the browser to get started programming with JavaScript. Everyone who has access to a browser can do this. And if you're reading Head First JavaScript Programming, we use the developer tools in the browser as a way to test and debug our programs. Unfortunately, every browser is a little bit different in terms of how the developer tools work and how they look. They all do basically the same thing, but getting to the developer console is a little bit different, and some of the tabs are different and so on. So I'm going to show you how to use the console in both Chrome and Firefox on the Mac. For other browsers, you can check out the instructions at wickedlysmart.com/hfjsconsole, which we put together as a companion for Head First JavaScript Programming. Firefox recently revamped their console, so make sure you have the most recent version of Firefox if your console looks substantially different from the one I'm about to show you. That said, the browser makers all seem to update the developer console tools fairly frequently, so yours may not look quite the same, but the functionality should be basically the same. For this video, I'm using Firefox 28 on the Mac. So the first thing you want to do is to open the developer tools. And the way you do that in Firefox is with the Tools menu, and then select Web Developer and Web Console. And you'll see the console appear at the bottom of your screen. So if we load a web page, that web page will appear at the top of the screen, and the console is here at the bottom. Notice that we have a little input area here at the very bottom, and this is where I can type in JavaScript statements and expressions and access information about the browser. So for instance, I can type in a value like 2, and you'll see that up here in the main area of the console. It's showing me what I typed and then what the response from the browser is. And in this case, I just typed a value, and the value of that value is the value itself, so it just gives me back 2. I can type in a string, same exact idea. I can also type in expressions like 2 plus 4, and it's going to compute the result of that and give me back 6. You're not limited to simple expressions in the console. You can declare new variables. So I can declare a new variable, x, and set its value to 3. Notice that this time, instead of getting back a value like 3, I got back a value undefined. And what that means is that the value of this entire statement, the statement where I'm setting the variable x to 3, is undefined. But the variable x has been defined and its value is 3, so I can type in x and get the result 3. This can be a little bit confusing at first, so it's important to understand the difference between typing in an expression like 2 plus 4 or 2 or high into the console and a statement like var x equals 3, where the value of the statement is undefined, even though we're actually setting the value 3 to x. Now that I have that variable, I can use it. So I can say x plus 4, and I should get back 7. And I can define another variable, y, and set that to, let's say, 5. And again, the undefined is the result of this statement, but y has been set to the value 5. Now, if I ever want to clear the console, all I have to do is click this button Clear, and it clears everything away, but the variables are still there. You'll notice that x and y still have their values. Those variables don't go away until you close the browser window or you load a page. Let's try loading a page now. I'm going to go ahead and load a file from Chapter 1. And in this case, I'm going to load the file index.html in Chapter 1, which happens to be our 99 bottles of beer on the wall example. And as you can see, the output from that example is being displayed in the console, showing all 99 bottles of beer being taken down and passed around. Now that I have loaded a page, my variables that I defined before, x and y, are no longer there. So when I try to type in their names and see their values, I'll get reference errors. And that's just because I loaded a page. Now let's take another look at the output that we saw from the file that I loaded into the browser. Notice that by each line of output, it shows the name of the file that I loaded and the line number where the code being executed generated the output that we see in the console. what I can do is click on that line number and it'll take me to the code. And notice that it's popping it open into a separate window here. And you'll see that it's highlighting line 14, which is corresponding to the item that I clicked on here. And it says console.log, take one down and pass it around, which is the text that we see here in the console. And I can do that for any of these line numbers. I can click on them and it'll pop up another window showing me exactly what line of code it was that generated that output in the console. And notice that we're using console.log to see that output in the console. That's the function that generates the output and places it into the console. And it opens up a new window each time you do that, so you might want to close it each time. Let's take another look at the code. Notice that in this case, all the code that we wrote for this example is at the top level. That is, it's not nested within a function. So that means that all the variables that we declare in this code are global variables, and therefore they're accessible to us in the console when the page is loaded. That means that I can use the console to inspect to see what the values of those variables are. So I can type in the name of the variable word, which is defined here, and see that its value is bottles, the string bottles. What about the value of count? Now there, its value is 0. And why is that? Because even though the variable count was initialized to 99, we're seeing the value of count at the end of the code, after all the code has executed. And what we did in the code was we looped and decremented count until it got to 0. And so that's why the value of count is currently 0. Now let's do the same thing in Chrome so that you can see how that works in that browser. So I'm going to close this and I'm going to open up the Chrome browser. And to get to the developer tools in Chrome, you want to use the View, Developer, JavaScript Console menu option. And just ignore all this stuff up here for me. That's just created by some extensions that I have installed. Let's go ahead and load the same file into Chrome. And you can see again, we see all the output from the program displayed in the console. And again, we see the name of the file and the line number that's generating that output on the right-hand side. And again, I can click on that and it takes me to the code. Not in a separate window this time, but in the same window. And you'll notice up here in the tabs, we have switched over from console to sources. And so just keep that in mind so that if you want to get back to the console, you just click on the console tab again. So I'll do that again just to make sure you got that. If I click on, let's say, line number 12 from index.html, it takes me over to the sources tab and shows me the code, and I can look here and see line number 12 is the line that generated that output. Let's go back to the console and type in some more JavaScript. We're not limited in JavaScript to just typing in simple things like var x equals 3 and 2 and hi. We can type in more complicated code too, so let's give that a try. I'm going to clear the console, and in Chrome, you just click on this little button up here to clear the console and make all that stuff go away. So first I'll declare a variable x and set it to 3. And again, you'll see undefined, meaning that's the value of the statement, but the value in x is set to 3. And then what I can do is I can type in a more complicated piece of JavaScript, like if x equals 3, then do something like alert x is 3. And we see an alert pop up indicating that x is indeed 3. So notice here that I typed all of this on one line. What if I want to type in multiple lines of code into the console? Can I do that? Well, let's give it a try and see. If x equals 3, and I'm going to hit return, and I'm going to get an error. That's because in the JavaScript console, when you hit return, JavaScript is expecting a complete statement, and we haven't typed in a complete statement here. We've only typed a partial statement, and there's pieces missing. So the way that you can do this is to use shift return. So I can type if x equals 3, and then hit shift return, and now it knows to expect more input. So I'll type in alert x is 3. And again, shift return and the closing brace. And now when I hit return, I get to see the alert because the code is correct. Let's take a look at some other kinds of errors you might encounter when you're using the console either to type in JavaScript yourself or to debug your code. What if we try to access a variable that is not defined? Like if we say if y equals 3, then alert y is 3. What happens then? We know that we haven't defined the variable y. So what we get is a reference error saying y is not defined. So the console is not just used for you to experiment with JavaScript, it's also used for you to debug your code. Let's go ahead and add a line of code to the index.html file in chapter 1 and make an error and see what happens. If I open up the index.html file, and let's add another line of code, console.log y is, and then we'll try to display the value of y. Now we know that this will create an error because we haven't defined y in this code. So I'm going to go and load this page again. And you'll see that we do indeed see an uncaught reference error, y is not defined, at line 12 in index.html. And again, I can click on that line and it's going to take me to that line of code and show me what the error is. So I'm going to go back to the console and also notice that we have a little red X here with a 1 next to it. That just means that we have one error displayed in the console. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the code and I'm going to fix that by taking out that line of code. But I'm going to now introduce another error. I'm going to remove the closing quote, the parentheses, and the semicolon from the end of this line of code. And I'm going to do that so that you can see the kinds of errors that you can expect to run across as you're developing code, and you might make typos in your code. So I'm going to save that and reload the page, and let's see what kind of error we get. Now we get a syntax error, unexpected token illegal, again on line 12. And you can see that because I'm not closing the string and the function call and don't have a semicolon, that at the end of this string, it's seeing a new line and then seeing console.log and a whole bunch of other code, and that doesn't make sense. JavaScript just can't make sense of that, so it's giving me that error. All right, let's see what happens if I put the quote back in, but I still forget to put on the closing parentheses and the semicolon. So I've saved that. I'm going to reload the file again. And now we get another syntax error, but this time it's unexpected identifier on line 13. So again, JavaScript is having trouble figuring out, okay, we haven't closed the parentheses, so what are we trying to do here? And it can't quite figure that out. Okay, so I'm going to type in the closing parentheses, but I'm going to leave off the semicolon. What do you think will happen then? So I've saved that, going to reload the page, and now the code works fine. So this is something that we talk a little bit about in the book. JavaScript is pretty forgiving when it comes to things like white space and semicolons, but leaving off a semicolon can lead to all kinds of problems. And so we really encourage you to make sure that you use that semicolon, even if technically it's not always needed. It's better to get in the habit of just using a semicolon at the end of most of your statements. So I'm going to save that and reload, and of course it should work like normal, and it does. Okay, so we have seen how we can create some simple expressions and variables in the console. We've also seen how we can do a little bit of debugging of our code. What about some more complex things like arrays and objects? Can you create arrays and objects in the browser console? You certainly can. So I'm going to clear the console and I'm going to go ahead and create a new array called myArray. And I'm going to initialize it to the array, let's say 99, 101, and 100. Just 3 values there. And again, the result of that statement is undefined, but when I type in myArray, you'll see that it is indeed an array with 3 values in it. I can also create an object in the console. I can type in var myObject equals, and open the object. Now, if you want to use multiple lines here, remember to use shift return, but I'm just going to put everything on one line, so I'm not going to worry about that. So this object will have two properties, x and y. And when I type in the name of the object, you'll see that it is indeed an object with two properties. And now that I've defined those, I can use them. I can say my array at 0 plus my object dot x, and the result is 102, as we would expect, because we're adding 99 and 3. You can even define new functions in the console. So let's do that. I'm going to define a function first with a function declaration. So I'm going to say function myFun, and I'm going to use shift return to create a new line, and then I'm going to say return n plus 1. So this function is just adding 1 to the number that we pass in. And so when I call my fun of 10, I should get back 11, and I do. I can also create a function with a function expression, so let's do that. So var my fun2 equals function of n. Again, shift return, and I'm going to return, this time I'm going to return n plus 2. So this function is going to add 2 to whatever we pass in. Shift return again, end the function with a semicolon because this is a function expression. Hit return, and now my fun2 of 2 should be 4, and it is. So what we've done here is add our own variables, simple variables like numbers and strings, as well as arrays and objects. So using the console is a great way to practice creating different types of variables. You can also access JavaScript's built-in functions using the console. So let's give that a try. I'm going to clear the console. And we've already seen that we can access the function alert. So I'll try that, and you can see that we get an alert. You can type console.log from the console, which is a little bit self-referencing, and you'll see that it displays whatever you pass it to the console. You can even use prompt at the console. So I'm going to prompt to enter a number, and it asks me for a number and gives me the result. Now remember that prompt always returns a string, so that's why we see the number in quotes there. So those are 3 built-in functions that you can access from the console. What about a built-in object? Well, let's try the built-in object math. We saw how to use this in Chapter 2 of Head First JavaScript Programming to generate random numbers for our battleship game. So if I type math.random, I'm going to get back a random number. And just like we did in the book, I can generate a random number, say, between 0 and 4 by typing in math.floor, math.random times 5. And every time I do that, I'm going to get back a random number between 0 and 4. Now, a quick way to re-execute the previous line of code that you just typed in without having to type it in again is to use the up arrow, and you'll see that it rewrites the code that you just typed in for you. So I can hit the up arrow and hit return and hopefully get a different number each time. And it looks like, yes, I'm getting a random number back. So I'm going to clear the console and show you another interesting thing to do with the console is to inspect built-in objects like window and document that you use to access the browser object model and the document object model respectively. This is a useful thing to do because it's really interesting to see all of the various properties and methods that these objects have available, many of which you may have never used, but some of which should look familiar to you. Let's start with window and see what that looks like. So I'm just going to type in window and hit return. And you'll see I've got a little error warning here, but I'm going to ignore that. And next you'll see that it shows the window object, and it starts showing me some of the properties that the window object has. But there are so many that it's not showing me everything. But it is showing me a little arrow here next to window, and I can click on that arrow and it expands to show me all of the properties that window has. And there are many. So as you scroll through here, you'll see there's a lot of properties, a lot of methods that are contained within window, because window represents the browser object model, so it's got to contain all of those browser related functions and properties that you can access when you're programming the browser with JavaScript. Now, as you scroll through here, you might come across some things that look familiar. We'll keep scrolling down a bit. And you'll see here a variable named count. Well, that is the variable from the code that we loaded into the page in index.html. And remember, count is a global variable, and when we store global variables, we store them in the global object, and that is window. So that's where that variable is getting stored. And we should see our other global variable in here too. That was named word. So that should be very near the bottom, and there it is at the bottom. So take some time and look through the window object and see what kinds of things you'll find in there. And eventually, as you do more and more JavaScript programming, you'll use some of those properties and methods. All right, let's take a look at the document now. The document is, remember, it's the variable that represents the document object model. That's the representation of the page that you loaded into the browser, and what we have loaded is a page named index.html. That is the 99 bottles of beer game, and we're not seeing any elements in the page. That's because the body is empty except for the JavaScript that we put in there. So when I open up the document object, I see that there's the HTML tag with some stuff in it. That's what the ... means, and then the closing HTML tag. So I can open that, and I see that the HTML tag contains the head and the body. So if I open up the head, I should see the meta tag and the title. And if I open up the body, I should see that we have the script. And if I open that up, I'll see the script that corresponds to the program that's in that page. And that's all that's in that page. So the document object represents the entirety of everything that's in your page. If we loaded another page, something like chapter 9, image.html, which was the image game that we built to test out our event object, then you'll see if we type in document, you're going to see it has a lot more because it's actually got some content in the page. And in this case, it's got an image. And then if you look at the head, you'll see that the script for this page is actually in the head of the document rather than the body. Another way to see the document object is using the Elements tab. So if we click on that, you're basically going to see the same thing that we saw in the console by typing in document, only this is a little bit nicer because not only do you get to see what's in your page, you also get to see the style that's applied to that particular element when you click on it. So I can click on image and I can see that the image has a margin of 20 and that the image size is 398 by 432. So this is a handy view to have into your HTML as you're building your page and trying to figure out how things should be laid out. Just make sure you click on console to get back to the console window. Now let's take a look at how that looks in Firefox because it's a little bit different. So I'm going to jump back to Firefox and I'm going to load the page. And I'm going to load the page that we used before, the index.html file from chapter 1, and then make sure that I've got the web console showing so that I can see everything. You'll see, of course, the output that we saw before. So I'm going to go ahead and clear that and type in window. Now notice what it does in Firefox is it returns this little object window, but it's got a line underneath indicating that I can click on it. So if I click on that, you'll see that it pops up the information about that object over here on the right-hand side, and I can scroll through that to see all the various properties and methods in the window object here. And it does the same thing with document. So if I type in document, it returns an object of type HTML document. And again, I can click on this and it brings up the document object over here on the right-hand side so that I can see all the various properties and methods that are available in the document object. Now, if I want to look at the page like we did in Chrome, I can use the Inspector tab. So remember, in Chrome, it's called the Elements tab, and in Firefox, it's called the Inspector tab. So if I click on that, I can see that the page consists of the HTML tag, the head with the meta and the title, and the body tag consisting of the script. And you can see that the code is cut off here. It's not showing all the script, but it's showing just the beginning of it. And if we load the chapter 9 image.html file, you can see that it's showing the image. And if I click on that, again, you can see the style information for that element over here on the right-hand side, which is, again, a handy way to help you as you're developing your HTML pages. And in Firefox, to get back to the console, just make sure you click on the console tab to get back. So this is just a beginning look at what you can do with the developer console in your browser as a way to experiment with JavaScript and as a way to debug and test your code as you're going through the examples in Head First JavaScript Programming. There's a lot more that you can do with the developer tools in the browsers, but I'll leave it at that for now. You know enough to get around the console, try out some JavaScript, and follow along in Head First JavaScript Programming as you write and test your code.